In the last few videos, we have talked about how both your emotions and actions are influenced by your beliefs. And on the topic of beliefs, we've spoken about how a very common worldview in the Western world was that man had dominion over the earth and therefore had to dominate it. So the topic of today is worldviews. We are going to explore how your worldview will shape your entire reality, and I'll do so by telling you a nice little story from Eric Ringmar about giraffes. Our story will follow 3 long-necked boys throughout important points in history and see what they can tell us about those moments in history, because they were all gifts to powerful people. Our first giraffe of today is going to be a giraffe around the Renaissance time in 1486 that was a gift to the powerful de Medici family in Florence, Italy. You should note here that the year is very important because 1486 was just a few years before Christopher Columbus sailed from Florence to discover what is now called America. At the time, we had a period that we in Europe call the Renaissance, which is a rebirth, but still, the known world for many Europeans was very much limited to Europe. And of course, the countries around the Mediterranean that their Roman ancestors had conquered before. Before the Renaissance, there was a period called the Middle Ages, and that was deeply religious. And as Astrology TikTok also will show you, is that you had people that were so religious, they were looking for signs from God left and right. These are signs, do not ignore the signs. Animals especially were taken to be a sign from God, a moral lesson to be interpreted by the scholars of the time. And, well, even though it was nice to be curious about the exotic, it was also considered a sin because you were prying into the secrets of God's creation and therefore was forbidden. You can imagine that if you need people to interpret something, the people doing the interpreting are going to have a lot of influence in what lessons are taken from it. And it's going to say more about them than it's going to say about the thing you're trying to interpret. For example, bumping into an attractive stranger on the bus can be seen as a sign if you believe in this kind of stuff. But it can also just be a regular occurrence if you are only half as clumsy as I am. Because if I were to believe in this stuff, then I must have been meant to be with a lot of people, and so far none of them have worked out. So after the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, all of a sudden it was not a sin anymore. It was allowed to experience the animals themselves, to be curious into them, and therefore people really emphasized experiencing the exotic, the oriental, the magnificent. So at the time, for the rulers it was very important to have a collection of exotic animals. It was a true pastime. They had their own private zoos, which we call a menagerie, which is like an expensive Pokemon card collection on steroids. And just like how China in the 1970s went on a charm offensive by handing out pandas to different world leaders to soften up their image, rulers at the time also did trade and exchange these exotic animals with other rulers in order to complete their collection. Most of the most exotic gifts that were given were by Muslim rulers, like the Sultan of Istanbul or the Sultan of Egypt. They were very good friends with the city-state of Florence, and therefore their relations became better. And it really did improve the public relations of those different countries because the Europeans didn't know much of any better from these countries. For example, the Turks at the time were considered to be unbelievably cruel, barbaric and misogynistic, and adherents to a demonic religion of Islam. It's nice to know that our understanding of Turks hasn't progressed much in the last 600 years, unfortunately. But of course, these gifts of the exotic animals would help butter up people and think of them more like exotic and oriental and mysterious instead of the negative words that they thought of them at the time. So, to keep improving relations and also their understanding at the European public, the Muslim rulers needed to spice up their image a bit. So, they naturally asked the influencers of the time, painters, to come over, show them the sexiness, the splendor, the absolute power of the Orient, and so they would come back documenting the women of the time and counteract some of the bad image that had been going around. It's kind of like how we have modern day influence that for some reason keep up hyping the idea of Dubai, even though most people that live there are absolutely miserable if you aren't super rich. One of the things that was usually shown off by these painters is that they captured the seraglios. It was a personal zoo of the sultans with all these exotic animals, and once the images came back to the rulers of Europe, they thought, we need one of those. Having these magnificent animals in your own personal zoo would reflect well on you, as people would come and stare in awe of how amazing you were. And it would reflect well on them because the way that people at the time really thought was to use analogies. They were trying to look at the hidden things that things have in common. They thought that walnuts would make you smarter because it looked like a brain, for example. So you can imagine that having these magnificent beasts reflected well on the ruler itself. When the people of Florence would finally see a giraffe that was completely unique to them, something you can't find anything similar of in Europe, a freak of nature, it blew their minds. People would come from far and wide to experience the creature with their own eyes. A real hype was created, and an euphoria that was experienced by the people there would create a demand for them for more exotic, to discover more for where this came from, what is behind this. So, with the analogies, you can imagine that it reflected very well on the majestic ruler. Seeing this shiny new majestic giraffe would open up many people's minds and want them to discover more about what was out there, what other exotic beings could possibly be there, what the world had to offer. It is then no wonder that a few years later the famous Christopher Columbus was asked to lead an expedition to discover the unknown and bring back more exotic resources to satisfy this demand for the exotic. The second giraffe in our story is going to be a giraffe gifted to the fresh king, Charles X of France. Fresh after the French Revolution, shortly after Napoleon died, we're talking about 1827. This date is important because it was just a few years before the French for the first time went into Africa to have bloody war with Algeria. So why then was the response to the same thing, a giraffe, so different in 400 years apart? Why did it in this case lead to bloody conquest? Well, let's look at the context. An Egyptian diplomat called Bernardino Drovetti was a close friend of the Egyptian Pasha at the time, Muhammad Ali. You can imagine Drovetti to be kind of like an Indiana Jones character, a real dealer in exotic artifacts and even exotic animals. And so, when the fresh King Charles X ascended to the throne, he thought he could ease up relations and be friends with both leaders by gifting an exotic gift. But part of the reason why gifting giraffes wasn't more common and giraffes weren't more known is because, you can imagine, they are very difficult to transport. And so, in order to get that done, our protagonist needed to ask esteemed scientist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, professor of zoology, to come over and check out the goods. So, our scientist Geoffroy was asked to come to Egypt, inspect the giraffe, and find a way to best transport it to Paris. It ended up being a voyage of a boat in order to get to Marseille and then walk the rest of the 880 kilometers by foot with the giraffe to the capital. It's very important to speak about science right now, because science at the time, it was in its infancy, is very different from the science that we have right now. Science at the time was very self-confident in its ability to just categorize everything in the world. Scientists thought they could know everything, and it was just a matter of documenting it and relating it to the underlying principles they thought were everywhere in the world. For them, everything was a law of nature, like gravity. And so, it's important to realize that for these scientists, nothing was ever unique. Nothing was a novelty. Every part of diversity was able to be traced back to the common principles that they had already categorized. For them then, the giraffe was interesting, sure, but it was just a data point. So the moment it got categorized in their taxonomy, the giraffe itself was wholly unimportant. On the one hand, sure, the giraffe was still an oddity, it was still magnificent, and it was gorgeous, and therefore it was still a hit among the common folk, and it would reflect well on their new king. On the other hand, we were living on a time of enlightenment, and so for the esteemed scientists, there was no room for being excited. It was just a time of science and reason. No room for superstition and signs from God like it used to be 400 years earlier, or maybe even still from the common folk. So back to our scientist Geoffroy. Once he had taken the boat to Marseille, he decided it was the smartest thing to walk 880 kilometers from Marseille to the capital of Paris. On the way, it was just like the Taylor Swift Eras tour. Crowds would gather around to see the magnificent giraffe. It would reflect very well on their new king. They thought it must be a sign of the glory of the new King Charles and strengthen his legitimacy. By the time the giraffe arrived to the capital, the king himself was like an excited child. He would want to see everything about it, how it walked, how it gaited, how it breathed. And so, his exotic prize, he would leave in the royal gardens to be seen by everyone. And people would gather from far and wide to experience this giraffe. And entire markets would flung up by people selling merchandise, people showing memorabilia that they wanted to remember this experience. But of course, like the hype markets that we have right now and the economy that's around it, once the hype dies down a summer later, all of a sudden no one really cared about the giraffe anymore, and the demand for goods of the exotic was going to go elsewhere. As you can see, around that time of the Industrial Revolution, people all of a sudden had way more need to buy both useful and nonsensical stuff to get this kind of merchandise. And in order to satisfy that demand for new stuff, you needed more raw materials. For the snobby scientist, however, the giraffe was never really that interesting. It was just an intellectual exercise to map it out in their categories. Scientists at the time were also usually incredibly racist. They thought that they understood Africa better than the Africans did, especially after the Rosetta Stone was deciphered. So instead of discovery, what if you combine the need for markets to have raw materials to the need to have intellectual superiority over other cultures and other races by mapping it out and knowing their world better than they do? You get the French chauvinism, especially after Napoleon, which is like a kind of nationalism that they want to conquer the world. And you have these very respectable scientific justifications of why it is necessary to do so. If you combine all of them, you've got a recipe for bloody conquest. Like the giraffe, Algeria was foreign yet known. It was different, but in an attractive way, not in a repulsive way, and therefore it was a prime target for invasion. While there were definitely people at the time that were considered cosmopolitan or liberal that thought that every society was equal and respectable, those worldviews never really came to power. So after the French Revolution, after Napoleon and the French being very proud people, this kind of worldview was way more dominant, and so the form that they decided to take was a bloody conquest, spreading the glory of France. So after the French Revolution, even the liberals at the time considered that there might be a need for expansionism. It wasn't as weird anymore to do something like invading other countries. Our final giraffe was a gift for the Chinese emperor at the time of 1414, decades before the European would actually start exploring the world like we spoke about. This time it's notable because it was just 2 decades before there were decrees that outlawed foreign trade and overseas travel. China could have been even more than they are right now, our world conqueror, if they just continued the exploration like the Europeans would do decades after. At the time, they already had massive convoys and expeditions into the east of Africa and Bengal and Sri Lanka. So it's a wonder, why did they never do so? And then why did they outlaw their overseas travel only 2 decades later? Well, the answer lies in the way that China viewed itself. Especially through 618 to 907 current era, China considered itself to be the beacon of humanity, the epicenter of the universe. Once a year there was a custom that all the tributary states, so all the states in the sphere of influence of China, like foreign trade partners in the Middle East, would come and bring gifts to the Emperor of China. And in his magnanimity, he would give back generously even more exotic gifts to show the splendor of the Chinese emperor. Of course, the emperor would also have its own personal zoo, and so foreign rulers would try to ingratiate themselves and become better friends with China by giving exotic gifts to add to the collection. But you have to understand, the people that had the ear of the emperor was a balance of power. You've got two major groups. You've got the eunuchs, the people that went on massive voyages to actually discover these things and exchange the gifts, have massive convoys that traded with foreign partners as well. And you have the Confucianists. And like the philosopher Confucius, the Confucianists were quite conservative and they thought that these voyages were a waste of money and time. They thought that the greatness of the Middle Kingdom was already the center of the universe, and so there's no point in exploring anything out of sight of it. Just like in a similar time in the Renaissance like we talked about, in China as well, exotic animals were studied for the lessons that they brought. They were signs from the heavens and therefore had to be interpreted by the scholars of the time. So back to our friend the giraffe, because originally it came from Kenya, it was brought by eunuch voyage to Bengal and then shown to the emperor. Once it saw it, we thought was magnificent. It was a sign from the heavens of how glorious he was, because the scholars needed to interpret it. And what they thought it was a unicorn that they were looking at, a creature of legend. And that meant that the reign of the emperor was going to be fortuitous and that he was a great ruler. So when they found out that the beast was called Girin in Somali, they thought, well, that's close enough. We call it Kilin as a unicorn in their own language. And just like an actual fortune cookie, once the lesson was learned, the giraffe was wholly unimportant and uninteresting and disregarded. And because they saw no point in the giraffe other than the lesson it had already brought, when the Confucianists came to power and they were already quite conservative, they banned all the overseas travel and thought it's not important, it's a waste of money, we're not getting anything out of it, and isolated themselves from the world. Especially because their worldview was that China was already the peak of humanity, and so what's the point? So what is the takeaway of all these stories? Every society has had their own worldviews, and the same thing, a giraffe, resulted in 3 massively different outcomes. Giraffe 1, during the Renaissance, got Europeans curious to explore the world and gather the exotic, and it helped discover America. Giraffe 2, 400 years later, got Europeans as well to do a very different thing and go the way of bloody conquest. And the third giraffe of China around the time of the Renaissance in Europe didn't actually make them go and discover, it made them self-isolate way more. So you can see that the same giraffe leads to very different outcomes, and even when there is a very similar way of looking at the world, just like having analogies for the Europeans or having lessons from the heavens from the Chinese, they can still result in different outcomes. The key here is their worldview, your upbringing, your environment, your socio-economic status, your habits, your experience, what you have been taught, what you have learned yourself, your culture, your race, your gender, your understanding of the world, and your values such as your right and wrong. All in all, your worldview is the way that you look at the world through your own eyes. It is completely unique to you. It colors in every experience that you have. And so it can be quite difficult to distance yourself from the way that you look at the world and envision possibilities outside of your worldview. Although it's difficult, I'd ask you to try it sometimes. Taking a step back, asking yourself, why do I think what I think? What is my normal? Why are these things normal to me? How do these factors play into it? And then after you have some realization of that, you can start asking, how can things be different? How can things be different for other people? So not just envisioning a better world, envisioning what other people are going through in the world that we live in right now, things we do not often see. But I'm making it sound like a worldview is very limited or a bad thing, but everyone has a worldview. You need to have a worldview because we live in a world where there are so many facts and stimuli and news coming at you at the same time that you cannot process it consciously all. You need to have a filter of some sort to filter which facts are important. How do I make sense of this? Which decisions do I spend energy on? Because if you don't, you'll get very easily overwhelmed. And so there are people that can have very differing degrees of stimulation. Wherever you are on the neurodivergent spectrum, it's important to know that everyone has a worldview. Even being able to take less in stimulation is going to affect your worldview. It's going to, for example, limit the amount of events that you can attend in a very short time. It's going to limit the amount of people that you want to hear speaking at any given time. And it's going to be very difficult for other people to put themselves in your shoes to live with you. And again, for you the same, because your lived experience, your worldview is different from someone else, it can be difficult for you as well sometimes to put yourselves in other people's shoes. We literally cannot take all the data that the world throws at us. It doesn't make any sense to us. We have to filter, and only then can we learn from it and make sense of it. So again, when we come back to AI has the ability to process all of this information and learn new things from it, but it doesn't know what it's looking at. But we have the ability to make sense of what we're looking at by having a worldview. So, in order not to get overwhelmed, our mind needs to filter. And what it does is to make little mental shortcuts so you don't have to spend energy on it on a day-to-day basis. Think about going zombie mode, that you go about your first part of the day in routine. You brush your teeth, you dress up, and most of these things, for most neurotypical people, is going to be automatic. Your brain doesn't really think about it. And so it has more space to actually deal with the things that is asked of it on a daily basis. But for some people, very little things are actually automatic, and so it can be very overwhelming to deal with the basic things of life. And of course, when I say that a worldview is always going to be limited, that means that you need other people to start understanding more about the world. You are going to have very persistent blind spot about issues that you do not experience. I might never really understand what it is like to be fully black or what it would be like to be a woman. I could have many different friends tell me about it with as intimate detail as possible, but the best I can come is trying to understand it, but I have not lived it. And so seeing how all of these different factors and experiences factor into someone's worldview is part of the beauty of it all. It makes them form the opinions that people have, but it can also make you be able to spot how did they get to that conclusion, and maybe it is based on some facts that are wrong. It can be based on statistics that just do not exist, or assumptions about life, things they have experienced that do not need to be there. And just like with the giraffe, my worldview might be very similar to that of someone else, but the way that we got to our conclusions might be very different. Or the opposite way around. You can also have that we are presented the same information and draw very different conclusions. So, let's go over a list of all the things that your worldview affects. It affects your entire reality, and when I say that, I mean it in the broadest sense of the word. It affects how you think, what facts you think are important to understand, how facts form into your narrative or do not. Even if you think, what is the bar to change your mind? If you are very convinced that you're right, it's going to take way more of a sudden transformative experience for you to get your come to Jesus moment and realize that you might have been wrong. But also everything relating to what is possible is affected by our worldview. What choices we think we have in any given situation. What actions we think are appropriate to act on in any given situation. And how we weigh the things that happened in our mind. What logic systems we buy into. But even before trying to think of a solution, it also starts way earlier, because those very questions that you are able to think of in your mind, the things that interest you, how you feel, who you can trust, are all influenced by your worldview. And so like the story, it's also the way that you interpret the world. Do you look for signs from God or signs from the angels or for the universe to tell you what you need to do? Or you can also think of how we interpret very common behavior or not. If your worldview is part of the standard gender roles, for example, paying on the first date is a very touchy subject in different cultures. For example, usually people say that a man should pay on the first date. And it's already a bit more progressive to say whoever asked you on the date is having to pay. And so it leaves room for women to pay for the date if they ask you on a date. But of course, in a world of standard gender norms, women do not often ask men on dates because that's a job of a man. But then paying for the first date, you have very different understandings as well. For example, in the Netherlands, it's way more egalitarian society when it comes to dating norms, so women can pay for the first date as well. But more often than not, a first date is split. So you send a tikkie, a payment request to pay what you ate. In Middle Eastern cultures, I've been told that women do not even have to bring their wallets often because it can even be seen as an insult for women to pay for the first date. So how you take something simple like paying for the first date can really influence what as a man you feel when it happens. For example, men can feel emasculated because women wanted to pay for the first date. It might be seen as a sign that she's not interested. Or it could be flattering that a woman is willing to pay the first date because she is then investing into the relationship just as you usually do. Again, different ways of interpreting the same thing. Even something simple as how you remember things is going to be influenced by your worldview, because if you are a police officer and you suspect someone to have done something even though you have no evidence, there have been cases that people have confessed to things that they haven't done by the power of suggestion. They would swear by something, a memory that have been implanted into them. The case about fake memories has been going off more and more often. You cannot always trust your memory, but also the knowledge that you have right now, remembering something that happened in the past, is going to be different than the knowledge that you have 30 years from now trying to remember the same event. You remember things by using the current understanding and thinking back to a moment in the past. But that is going to be affected by your understanding right now. For example, if you think about abuse victims, if they learn more on their path of getting rid of their abusive partners, they might slowly start to recognize that the same things that happened might actually have been considered gaslighting or abuse, which they wouldn't have said when they were in the relationship. So now that you know how important a worldview is, how it shapes your entire reality, you can start developing this skill by taking a step back, thinking, why do I think what I think? And so learning more about your worldview and your blind spots and communicating that with others can learn a lot about reality and be able to put yourself in other people's shoes easier. It's easier to make connections that way as well, therefore. So it's also a fun exercise. Listening to other people, understanding why they believe what they believe, what their worldview is, might not only help you understand them, relate to them, it also helps you to convince them sometimes by tracing back where your misunderstanding lies. And that is an inherent part of good communication. Slowly but surely, you'll become better at this life skill. You'll start to see how your worldview works. You'll start to understand how other people's worldview works by seeing their lived experiences and trying to cover the blind spots that you usually have. You will start to relate to other people better, have closer connections with people, and that means that you invest a part of yourself into them. You will learn a lot more about yourself by having stronger connections with other people. It is not just a lonely process of self-reflection. And all of this is just to keep an open mind. And so we got another one under our belt. It truly is a journey. I hope you can see the connections between the videos that we've made beforehand, that these are really lessons that you'll start learning on top of one another. And so if you haven't seen one of the videos that I've mentioned before, I have a link here so that you can find them, and hopefully you'll find them interesting. So like, subscribe, comment down below if you have any ideas of videos you'd like to see me cover, because I'm open to hearing it. Anything to boost the channel at this point. If you have people that you think would find this interesting in some way, please share the video. This is the best way to start building up our platform, our community, and maybe I'll see you next time. So if there's nothing further, I'll see you in the next one.